Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on vanadium opportunities on the rise. My name's Gavin Loyden. I'm the Managing Director of QEM Limited, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. And joining me on the panel is a couple of my fellow vanadium developers here in Queensland, Tom Northcott, Managing Director of Vecco Group, Shaun, CEO of Richmond Vanadium Technologies, my apologies, and Shaun will be joining us shortly. And Jack Better, Senior Executive of Roskill. Roskill is an industry leader in providing accurate and up-to-date analysis on the commodities markets and, most importantly for us, on vanadium. So just before we begin, any questions that you may have, please pop them into the chat panel. We'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the sessions. So let's jump right in. Welcome, Jack. Maybe you could give us set the scene by giving a quick overview on the vanadium market as it stands today and insights into the future. And thanks very much for getting up at 4 a.m. in the UK to join us. Great effort. Welcome.
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, no worries at all. So we've just published the 18th edition of our multi-client vanadium report this month, which includes our independent 10-year outlook for supply, demand and prices. So yeah, thought it might be useful to set the scene and spend about 5 minutes discussing what's happened in the market over the past couple of years, where we find ourselves today and the impact, of course, of COVID-19 and then our outlook for the future. So in terms of understanding market developments over the past few years, I think it makes sense to go back to 2017, as since then we've seen prices creep up throughout that year, reach 10-year highs in 2018, and then correct pretty sharply in 2019. So what caused the price rises of 2017 and 2018? Well, I think it was a combination of both demand and supply side factors. On the demand side, by far, the most important factor was the high expectation for future demand and prices owing to new rebar standards in China, mandating the use of microalloying agents like vanadium. So there was a real expectation of higher and sustained demand for vanadium in China, which was supported by lots of purchasing and restocking in 2017. And at the same time, there was considerable excitement over vanadium redox batteries, which also supported a really positive demand outlook. And that all came about amidst a perceived tightening of global supply. Feedstock capacity had been diminished when Evraz Highveld shut down in South Africa in 2015. That accounted for more than 10% of global feedstock capacity at the time. But there was no meaningful price reaction to the Evraz closure, as inventories at the point were very high. But between 2015 and 2017, those global inventories were gradually drawn down. So feedstock availability tightened, and that was exacerbated by some shutdowns in China, and China also banning the import of some vanadium-bearing slags. And all of these factors together, I think, pushed prices up. But of course, they came down pretty quickly in 2019. And again, that's because of a combination of factors. The main one being that the spike in demand wasn't as sharp as expected. Chinese mills had implemented the new standards prior to the official enforcement date of November 2018. And smaller mills benefited from a tolerance period where they didn't have to conform to the new standards. In addition, we saw lots of, much higher than expected anyway, substitution for ferrovanadium for ferroniobium, which resulted in lower than expected demand for vanadium. And then on the supply side, we saw higher than expected output from Chinese co-producers who actually increased production about 19% year on year. So more supply than expected, lower the demand than expected, and therefore the price corrected. So of course, today we find ourselves in a world hopefully now emerging from the impact of COVID-19, and very much I think the short-term outlook for all commodities markets will of course be underpinned by COVID-19 related factors. Our view is that the Chinese steel industry and thus the Chinese vanadium industry will be relatively insulated from the pandemic, whilst in the rest of the world there's going to be a sharp fall in steel production, which will probably impact demand for vanadium outside of China. Seems to be proving the case at the moment. Of course, Q2 Chinese steel production looking pretty strong. So we expect a market surplus for vanadium this year of about 6,000 tons, with prices remaining close to their current levels. Longer term, though, we're pretty optimistic. We forecast 2.2% annualized growth over the next 10 years for the vanadium market, with growth in steel at a similar rate. We expect China to increase its share of vanadium consumption up towards about 60% by the end of the decade. We think growth in steel, growth in demand for vanadium in steel is going to benefit from not just higher production of steel, but also a higher usage intensity, particularly in rebar. We expect steady growth in demand for vanadium in other applications like non-ferrous alloys and chemicals. And there's maybe a bit more uncertainty about the future of demand for vanadium redox flow batteries, but also a lot more upside potential. Of course, VRBs, as I'm sure we'll discuss in this chat, they face a number of challenges on their road to mass commercialization, such as their exposure to vanadium prices and competition with other competing storage technologies. Just to finish on the supply side, set against a reasonably, therefore, robust outlook for demand, there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of the outlook for vanadium supply. Most supply today comes from the co-production route. About 70% comes via that route. And we think that slag producers in China are close to their production capacity. And probably the top 5 in China that account for about 90% of slag supply are close to capacity. Maybe there could be a bit more primary production. That currently accounts for just under 20% of global supply, but we think probably ramp-ups and expansions will be limited to Largo in Brazil or Bushveld in South Africa. In China, coalstone producers act as a swing producer depending on economics. Secondary supply could also increase. That's not limited by processing capacity so much as it is by the necessary feedstock available to process. There may be some upside to secondary production owing to IMO shipping regulations requiring the use of more refining catalysts. So theoretically, there could be more vanadium to process. And then, of course, there's a significant number of vanadium projects that remain in the pipeline. And a number of these are probably going to need to come on stream over the outlook period if supply is going to meet demand. In our base case, we expect about 20,000 tons of vanadium feedstocks going to be required from new sources of supply between now and the end of the decade, and that really has to come from an increase in secondary or indeed from new projects. So yeah, that was a quick overview of where we've come from and where we are now and where Roskill thinks we'll be in the future. So I'll hand back to you, Gavin.
Yeah, very interesting. And I note yesterday that there was a little bit of a discussion around this, particularly from, I think it was from Harry Fisher from CRU. His view was a little bit more buoyant, I think, in the fact that he was suggesting there may be a premium attached to Australian vanadium prices moving forward, given that the high standard of ESG in Australian companies, sovereign risk, issues like COVID. How do you see that factoring in?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility, not just in this market, but others. It's something that's widely talked about in battery materials markets, particularly cobalt. I think some of the Australian projects have the potential for considerable competitive advantage. As I said, nearly 70% of this vanadium market is actually supplied by Chinese co-producers that are beholden to iron and steel market dynamics. They're not pure play vanadium producers. So yeah, some of the Australian players really do have an opportunity. And as you say, with the regulatory environment there, the ESG environment there is potential that consumers very mindful of where their material is going to come from in the future are going to pay a premium for that.
Yeah, exactly. Look, we've with new additions to the lexicon, if you like, things like new economy metals and critical minerals and so forth, and vanadium sits in both those categories. As far as Australia is concerned, this may not be your point of expertise specifically, but as far as Australia is concerned, there seems to be quite a bit of support at all levels of government for developing projects in Australia, and certainly some of the discussions over the last couple of days would point toward that. Maybe we'll bring Tom in at this point in time. Tom's model is a vertical integration from pit to manufacture, if you like, through batteries. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about that value add and broadening the value position for commodities, and again, vanadium fits squarely in that basket. So Tom, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think, Gavin, to pick up on some of the things from Jack's talk, is that it's clear that we're going to need some more primary supply driven by the steel markets over the forecast period. But we're also going to need to look at these new markets that's really what's going to drive fundamental new primary supply. So that's really what we've been looking at as a business model. It's an area where I think Queensland has an opportunity. I think to go back to your question a little bit, and what we're looking at is from the pit through to electrolyte production. We're sticking to our wheelhouse. We're not a battery company, and we don't want to be, but we see an opportunity to complement that industry. And we can sort of see a bit of a situation at the moment where there's a lack of vanadium batteries coming into Australia because there's no electrolyte production, and there's no electrolyte production because there's no batteries coming in. So really what we're trying to do is look at a model that starts to bridge that gap and bring those two industries together and collaborate on putting storage into some of the renewables that have already been constructed, look to optimise those. And in doing so, it's a good opportunity for Queensland where we can take a mineral and process it and turn it into an end product. There's not too many things here that we can do that. So it's an opportunity. There's, I think, a limited window. We've got a window over sort of the medium term to make this happen. And I think it's up to the producers to look at starting to create this market.
Yeah, agreed. Look, I think we've got Shaun on the line now. We may not have him visually. Are you there, Shaun?
Yeah, I'm here, Gavin. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. We don't have your video, mate, but we can hear you. So what we have been discussing, I'm not sure how long you've been on the line, but we've been discussing a little bit about the market, and Tom's gone on to talk about some value add to vanadium. I was going to touch on some of the more technical aspects with you without getting too deep into a dive, Shaun, particularly about how there may be an advantage for vanadium produced from shale as opposed to some of the magnetite developments of shale, even though some of the metal elements that are in the magnetite are proving difficult to bring into a electrolyte development. Do you have anything you can add to us on that?
Sure. I'll try. Yeah. As you know, traditionally, vanadium is largely supplied by the people using titanium magnetite to make steel. So they produce sludge, then the sludge have a high vanadium. That seems traditional. That's probably 90, 70, 80% of the total supply. So there was now because it's a byproduct, difficult to price and whatever, they always price it very low. As with vanadium demand increase, I think there's a shortage of vanadium direct vanadium production. For people with titanium magnetite, you need to build a big furnace, almost like you're building a steel mill first before you get your vanadium out from it. Firstly, it's very costly. Secondly, when you get it to a ferrovanadium, which is about 80% vanadium and 20% iron, that's the most efficient product that these people can supply. It's very good. It's good enough for people doing steels. Like you want to add a bit of vanadium into a steel. You don't need to add pure vanadium. You add a ferrovanadium. That's by itself meet your objective. But when the battery people comes in, they need a really quite a pure electrolyte. You can't have too much iron in that. So you need to produce actually pure vanadium pentoxide. You transport that around so people can dissolve it again in sulfuric acid to make an electrolyte. Then the problem is if you start with ferrovanadium to do that, then you have to remove all the iron content in that. That is very costly. It's not really very competitive. So from that point, I think the shale vanadium source vanadium get an advantage because most of that resource you use acid method to extract the vanadium one way or the other. Then you actually, if the battery plant sits next to you, you don't need to make it into vanadium pentoxide. You can just directly produce an electrolyte. If if you do have to transport the material, the product around the world or something, maybe electrolyte is too difficult. So you actually make that into vanadium pentoxide. Naturally, it does not contain much iron in it at all. Therefore, we have a product purposely, perfectly match the demand of the battery people. Also, we did, Richmond Vanadium did a lot of work on our project there. Mainly it was just like how we get the vanadium out and how to optimize the process. And we have a PFS just about to complete. And we got all the models, everything there. We can produce vanadium pentoxide at much competitive rate, cost-wise, than the people using titanium magnetite. Our capex will be probably only 20% of their capex, and the OPEX will be about 80% of their OPEX. So that would put, if that thing, the current market price is not very good, it's working against us, obviously. But if the market recovers a little bit, we get a project running in North Queensland, we'll certainly put North Queensland on the vanadium map of the world, because we get, like QEM, Vecco, Richmond Vanadium, and a few other operators, multi-con there. There's quite a lot of world-class resources there. It's just, I think it's would be very good for Queensland, I would say, if the government and all type of stakeholders see the potential there. We become a predominant supplier of vanadium pentoxide to the world, not based on titanium magnetite, based on shale-based vanadium.
That's very interesting, Shaun. So thanks for your clarification there, because obviously the growth in the battery sector is going to be driven by price, and if that electrolyte price can be brought back to reasonable, rational levels and kept at that sort of level through this development cycle of battery development as well as mine development, I think we've placed ourselves in a pretty good position.
Yes, I agree. I think that's just waiting for the price cycle to turn a little bit, because battery demand for vanadium, the battery index has not get to the level where you start fully industrialized. Our conversation with some of the large battery sort of projects, they were saying, they're sort of for the vanadium battery to be competitive against the lithium battery, they need a vanadium price below $15 a pound, vanadium pentoxide below $15 US, which is about 2.5 times the current price, I suppose. When the vanadium price at, when it went up to $28, $30 per pound, the battery people lost their competitive, advantage. Now, sure. I think they're probably working hard to get that one back up again.
Yeah, that's true, and I think there are a lot of battery producers worldwide who are out to get involved at an early stage in project development as more of a strategic partner than so much of an offtake partner. But we're certainly seeing that in our business, and I'm sure Tom's the same. So if we can keep those prices at a reasonable level, then I think we've got a great opportunity to get that battery industry kicked off here in Australia, rather than just import that product as well, because there's no reason they can't be developed, and the government at all levels is certainly supporting that endeavour.
Yeah, agreed.
So I just take the opportunity to mention to the listening audience as well that you can get in your questions a little bit earlier if you wish to do so, so that we don't have a little bit of a glut. Some of the earlier panel discussions have had a bit of a glut of questions at the end, which will make it a little bit difficult on the time consumption. So if you do have some questions, feel free to send them through to the chat room now, and we can start to list those and get to them at the end of the conversation. So I just want to get that across. So the other, you mentioned, Jack, some of the issues around COVID in regards to restrictions on, or potential restrictions on production output. Do you see that being even further effective in particularly Brazil with Largo, and particularly in South Africa, where, you know, the COVID is certainly not under control by any means, Brazil being a standout in that. Do you see that affecting, or has that affected Largo's output at this point in time?
I don't think it has affected supply as much as it might have in this market. I mean, obviously with such a huge concentration of supply coming from China, the fact that China were pretty much up and running again by Q2, and in Q1 you normally have the Chinese New Year festival anyway, which results in subdued output. Pretty much means that I think on a global basis, supply hasn't been too interrupted. Of course, I think in Brazil and South Africa, as you point out, there is that real possibility that you will get some supply disruptions, and therefore the likes of Largo, Glencore, Bushveld could face a challenging environment ahead. But I think it's more the sort of geographic spread of demand that will be interesting for the rest of the year. Chinese steel production in Q2, as I said earlier, looking pretty solid, thus vanadium consumption in China pretty robust. In the rest of the world, perhaps things aren't going to be quite as bad as we initially thought, but I think, you know, challenging times ahead in North America and Europe, which may result in lower vanadium consumption in those parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess counter to that, you mentioned about 2% growth in steel. Most of that driven by China, I guess, because they're obviously building a great deal more rail with the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. That would seem a conservative approach, do you think, or is a view, or do you think there may be further capacity for growth in the Chinese market moving forward?
I think, yeah, there may well be. It probably all depends on the extent to which the Chinese government's going to implement stimulus plans as a response to the impacts of COVID-19. There's already been a considerable amount of stimulus and infrastructure announced, and that's positive news for construction steels and microalloying agents like vanadium and to a lesser extent niobium.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And I think you know, there's obviously a lot of interest from US companies to get involved in primary vanadium production at the moment, given they don't have any domestically. Issues like I should say, agencies like the Critical Minerals Facilitation Offices is obviously going to get behind some of that. I've seen the prospectus on that from the US. Do you see a lot of US investment coming into Australia in that regard?
Yeah, I'd expect to see more as well. I think, you know, vanadium fits the profile of a critical material very well. Critical material is pretty much defined on the supply side by a risk of supply shortage or a high concentration in one country. And vanadium has that twofold, doesn't it? It's not only highly concentrated in China, but its supply is dependent, as I said earlier, on iron and steel market dynamics, not purely on vanadium demand. And then in terms of its economic importance, it's not only used in steel and a range of other things, but also, you know, could be a fundamental part of energy storage and our path to a green technology. So very much a critical material, and one that a lot of countries don't have. So I think they'll be keen to invest in places like Australia or Canada, in particular, that do have some of those projects and could easily serve foreign markets that don't have access to vanadium and maybe want to diversify their supply chains away from places like China.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there certainly seems to be a lot of support. If the last couple of days within the conference has been anything to go by, certainly from all levels of government, there's been a number of agencies open in that regard, and certainly seems to be some available funding to develop projects and to certainly look at that downstream value add. And again, vanadium fits nicely into that space, given that there are a number of directions that can go. And I don't think anyone's really spoken about the renewal of the Australian steel industry either, as it relates. We've got the new industry starting off down in Whyalla again with Mr. Gupta's projects in South Australia. I'm not sure where they're sourcing their vanadium from at the moment for their steels, but it would be something that would be certainly on a growth trajectory here as well. So it's for a domestic audience, and I think resilience is becoming an issue given the COVID situation. It's really exposed Australia's lack of resilience, and I think again, vanadium being a new economy metal and an energy metal, as well as a steel production metal. I think if you look at it on a wholly domestic front, there's probably a bigger opportunity than would otherwise be realised in other countries. How do you see that, Tom?
Yeah, I think Gavin, there may well be some opportunities. There does appear to be a push to bring manufacturing, and steel may well be a part of that they bring back to Australia. I guess we do see the larger opportunity in the storage market simply because of the amount of vanadium that does go into it. But look, there may well be some opportunity on that side. But I think fundamentally the key growth is going to come from the storage side, and but I think it's on us and it's on government to help facilitate the growth of that market. And certainly the Queensland Government have been very supportive of all of our vanadium projects up in the northwest, and that's certainly been well appreciated. And I think as we start to move forward, I think we would all like to look for that support on the downstream side, and look to for some assistance to facilitate the growth in that market. We're fundamentally starting a new industry, and I think that creates a lot of opportunity for jobs growth, which is particularly important in these times. And there's a significant opportunity for the green energy and that whole thing that seems to be front of mind these days.
And Jack, you mentioned there may be a little bit of uncertainty around the growth in the VRB market. We've got a few minutes left. Maybe you'd just like to expand on where you may see some of those bumps in the road. Is it just around pricing, or is it around capacity for those batteries to be rolled out at scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think pricing, is probably the biggest issue. Flow batteries have a comparatively lower power and energy density compared to other technologies, which limits their use of stationary applications, for which, of course, they are perfect. I suppose the low efficiency of the battery, the high cost of the electrolyte, which affects the cost of the battery and may limit the competitiveness of that sort of VRB battery to long duration systems with high energy to power ratio. I think a lot of it may come down to regulation. I mean, that's really what's happened and created the lithium ion story in China and then the rest of the world. And the stroke of a politician's pen could have a very powerful impact on VRB as a technology source. So if we see more governments taking energy storage seriously, and there can be some subsidies to help mitigate that volatile vanadium price, that really might help with regard to the commercialization. As I say, in our base case, we're relatively conservative. We see steady growth in demand for vanadium in VRB, but our high case is really a high case, and it could spike by the end of the decade. It really depends on how ESS takes off, energy storage takes off, and then whether vanadium maintains its fractional market share of ESS at the moment, or whether it can really eat into that. And as Tom pointed out earlier, these things consume a lot of vanadium, so it could ramp up very quickly.
Yeah, and there's also the combination effect as well. It's not necessarily an us and them scenario.
Absolutely.
Companies like Red Tea, now Infinity, that have got both of those capacities. It's an integrated vanadium and lithium battery. So it's not necessarily just an us and them story, I don't think, going forward. And it's, I think there's plenty of space in that energy storage market. Sorry, go on, Tom.
Well, I was just going to say that is a good point, and it's we don't see it as we have to be the only one in. The energy mix is going to be hydro in terms of storage. It's going to be hydro. It's going to be lithium, vanadium, and I'm sure other things as well. And it's sort of all of the above, but it's such an enormous market that we don't really see it as that much of a threat. There's a long way to go until we reach capacity in that. So. And as you said, there are some cases where the lithium and vanadium combination does make a good storage solution. So we don't really see lithium as a huge threat in the space. It may complement it, and at the very least, there's enough market share that there's an opportunity for vanadium batteries within that mix.
And I think there's also a safety aspect that needs to be thought about as well when you're talking about scale, longevity of battery, life of mine, efficiency, as well as the overall safety of vanadium batteries as opposed to lithium. But as again, I don't really see it as an us and them story. It's, do you have anything to add to that, Shaun?
Yeah, I think was quite right. I think for the renewable energy sector, I think if you look at the scale for energy storage at the power grid scale, I think lithium is probably will fall back behind vanadium. It's like Tom was saying, it's good. Jeff was saying it's bigger and the cost heavy. But it's very long life, and also its scale is just not restricted. You can build whatever scale you want. There's new development in the battery technology part. They trying to increase the energy density, which means they have a battery inside the battery, which was quite an innovative idea. What they have is you have the vanadium battery, you're charging up your vanadium electrolyte. Then when that charge get to say 80-85% charge, it starts to recharge another sort of set of cells, which are based on a high energy sort of chemical component. That is the increase the energy density of the vanadium battery by about 3 times. But that's in the laboratory stage, and I saw that. I see them doing it, but obviously, it'll take a bit of time for that to roll out. But if the government are serious about storing very large scale storage of energy, like you want to be able to have megawatts or multi megawatts hours of storage, I think the benefit of vanadium will come into play, and it's just a matter of time for the regulators and the market to realize, like you quite rightly pointed out, it's just not safe to have lithium battery of that mega scale, even if you have the supply. Vanadium battery, well, you can put it anywhere, it's safe. It's not going to cause you any problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where we need to wrap it up, gentlemen. That's pretty much us out of time. I've yet to see any questions coming through as yet, so we might continue on for a little while until we get the final wrap up. Yeah, so obviously safety is an issue, particularly with scale. The other issue, I guess, would be disposability of lithium at the end of the day. I know I said earlier it's not an us and them thing, but we do have a slant given the discussion we're in. So that, I guess that's another issue that may come to the fore in years to come. Lithium is a thing to dispose of. It's really worth recycling. I know there are some companies working on that at the moment, but it seems to be some way off. So yeah.
Just to pick up on that point, I think there's certainly an environmental reason behind or environmental benefit from that, and the fact that it doesn't degrade in the battery, not to any material extent, does make it quite unique. And I know there's been discussion around the model, but it does then lend itself to that sort of leasing model on the electrolyte side. A producer can retain the ownership, finance that leasing, and retain that value on their balance sheet. So over the course of the mine life, you can build up a very valuable asset. And
about a minute to go, gents. Sorry to interrupt you there, Tom. Go on.
No, that's all right. No, I was just going to finish by saying that it effectively allows you to sell that pound of vanadium multiple times over the course of the life of the asset, and then on. And in doing so, you create a recurring revenue stream and so on. And look, that takes time. It takes some years to have a payback on it, but it's a unique thing that comes with the metal.
That's right, and that has a little bit of a leveling effect on the pricing as well.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're going to wrap it up, gentlemen. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm not sure if you hang around for the 5 o'clock session, but I'll pop into that one. Thanks very much again. Thanks, Jack, for getting up so early, mate. You better get back to bed for a few hours, I think. Thanks, Tom.